In the heart of Rome, where cobblestone streets wind through centuries of history, there lived a man whose life revolved around uncovering the past. This man wasn't flashy or famous, far from it. He was quiet, thoughtful, and deeply curious about the stories hidden in old books and forgotten documents. His name was Dr. Samuel Leavitt, but to those who knew him, he was simply the historian. Samuel spent most of his days buried in research, often losing track of time as he pored over ancient manuscripts. He had dedicated his career to studying the Vatican's long and intricate history, fascinated by how the Church shaped not just religion but also politics, culture, and human lives across generations. To him, every faded letter on crumbling parchment held a clue to understanding the world better. One chilly morning, while working in the dimly lit corners of the Vatican Library, something unusual caught his eye. It wasn't gold-embossed covers or fancy seals that drew his attention. It was a plain, almost unremarkable book tucked away on a dusty shelf. The spine was cracked, and its pages looked brittle, like they hadn't been touched in decades. Something about it felt off. Most documents in the library were cataloged meticulously, their contents well known to scholars. But this one seemed different, untouched, as if someone didn't want it found. Curiosity got the better way, and Samuel carefully pulled the book down. As he opened it, he noticed the writing inside was in Latin, an old form of it too. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than another historical record. But as Samuel began translating bits and pieces, his heart started pounding. The words hinted at something extraordinary, something explosive. They spoke of decisions made behind closed doors, actions taken in secrecy, and consequences that rippled far beyond what anyone could have imagined. For weeks, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something monumental. He decided to dig deeper, cross-referencing the mysterious manuscript with other sources scattered across Europe. Each new piece of evidence confirmed his growing suspicion. This wasn't just some obscure relic of the past. It pointed to a shocking truth, one tied directly to Pope Francis, the current leader of the Catholic Church. Samuel wrestled with himself over what to do next. On one hand, he knew revealing such information would stir up controversy, maybe even anger powerful people. On the other hand, he believed history shouldn't stay hidden if it impacted so many lives. After countless sleepless nights, he made up his mind. Whatever secrets lay within these pages deserved to see the light of day, for the sake of truth, transparency, and humanity itself. Little did Samuel know, his decision would set off a chain reaction that would reach far beyond the walls of the Vatican. What happened next would leave millions questioning everything they thought they knew, and bring them to tears in ways no one could predict. As Samuel delved deeper into the manuscript, he realized that this wasn't just another dusty artifact from the past. Every page seemed to whisper secrets, secrets that had been locked away for decades, maybe even centuries. The Latin script was difficult to translate, but Samuel's years of experience made him patient. He worked tirelessly, often skipping meals and ignoring phone calls, determined to piece together the puzzle. What he uncovered was both astonishing and unsettling. The document spoke of a decision made long ago by someone who would later become Pope Francis. Back then, he was known as Archbishop Jorge Mario Bergoglio, serving in Argentina during a tumultuous period in the country's history. The manuscript hinted at actions, or perhaps inactions, that had far-reaching consequences. It suggested that choices made during those turbulent times affected thousands of lives in ways no one could have foreseen. Samuel didn't want to jump to conclusions. After all, history is rarely black and white. It's full of gray areas where intentions and outcomes collide. So, he decided to dig further. Over the next few months, he traveled across Europe, visiting private archives, meeting with fellow historians and tracking down obscure records. Each new discovery added another layer to the story, painting a picture that grew more complex and more troubling with every step. One evening, while sitting in a dimly lit room at a small library in Spain, Samuel found a letter that sent chills down his spine. Written by a priest who had served alongside Archbishop Bergoglio, the letter described events that aligned eerily with what Samuel had read in the Vatican manuscript. It talked about moments of moral struggle, difficult choices, and the weight of responsibility resting on human shoulders. The letter ended with a haunting line. "History will judge us not by our intentions, but by the scars we leave behind." That night, Samuel sat alone in his hotel room, staring at the documents spread out before him. His mind raced with questions. Should he keep going? Was it right to expose something so deeply personal about a man now revered by millions? Or did the world deserve to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be? These weren't easy questions, and Samuel wrestled with them for days. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore: the human impact. This wasn't just about politics or religion. It was about real people whose lives had been touched, for better or worse, by decisions made long ago. And if Samuel chose to stay silent, wouldn't he be complicit in keeping their stories buried? With renewed determination, Samuel returned to Rome. He spent weeks organizing his findings, ensuring every claim could be backed up by credible evidence. He knew that once he went public, there would be no turning back. Critics would attack him. Supporters would rally behind him, and the Vatican itself might try to discredit his work. But Samuel also knew that truth has a way of coming out eventually, and when it does, it demands to be heard. Finally, after months of painstaking effort, Samuel felt ready. He called a press conference inviting journalists from around the world to hear what he had uncovered. As the date approached, anticipation built. Whispers of something big spread through academic circles and newsrooms alike. People wondered, what could possibly shake the foundations of an institution as ancient and powerful as the Catholic Church? On the day of the announcement, Samuel stood nervously in front of a packed auditorium near St. Peter's Square. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and the air buzzed with tension. For a moment he hesitated, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. Then, taking a deep breath, he began to speak. What followed was a revelation that left the audience stunned and set off a chain reaction that would ripple across the globe. Samuel's voice trembled as he began to speak, but his words carried a weight that silenced the room. He started with the basics, explaining how he'd stumbled upon the manuscript, the months of research that followed, and the painstaking process of verifying every detail. But it wasn't long before he got to the heart of the matter. "The document I found," Samuel said, pausing to look directly at the audience, "reveals a chapter in history that has remained hidden for decades. It involves decisions made during a difficult time in Argentina, a period marked by political unrest and widespread suffering. These decisions, tied to Archbishop Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who is now Pope Francis, had consequences that reached far beyond what anyone could have anticipated." The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of cameras recording. Reporters leaned forward, pens scribbling furiously as Samuel continued. He didn't mince words. He laid out the facts plainly, explaining how the evidence pointed to actions, or perhaps inactions, that affected thousands of lives. He shared excerpts from the letter he'd found in Spain, quoting the haunting line about scars left behind. His tone was calm but firm, as if he were speaking not just to the people in the room but to the world. When Samuel finished, the silence lingered for a moment longer. Then, like a dam breaking, the questions came pouring in. Journalists shouted over one another, their voices rising in a chaotic symphony. Some asked for clarification, others demanded proof, and a few challenged Samuel's motives outright. But through it all, Samuel remained composed, answering each question with care. He knew this wasn't just about him, it was about the truth he'd uncovered and the lives it touched. By the end of the press conference, the story was already spreading like wildfire. News outlets around the globe picked up the story within hours, splashing headlines across websites, newspapers, and TV screens. Social media exploded with reactions, some outraged, some skeptical, and others deeply moved. People debated passionately, sharing opinions, theories, and emotions. For, Many Catholics, it was a moment of reckoning. How could they reconcile their faith in Pope Francis with the revelations Samuel had brought to light? For others, it was an opportunity to question authority and demand accountability. As the days passed, the controversy only grew. The Vatican issued a brief statement, neither confirming nor denying the allegations. Instead, they urged calm and called for prayerful reflection. But this vague response did little to quell the storm. Critics accused the Church of dodging responsibility, while supporters argued that context mattered, that understanding the full picture required looking beyond isolated incidents. Amidst the chaos, Samuel found himself thrust into the spotlight. Strangers approached him on the streets, some thanking him for his courage, others accusing him of betrayal. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, and his inbox overflowed with emails from people sharing their thoughts, both supportive and hostile. It was overwhelming, to say the least. But what struck Samuel most were the personal stories. People began reaching out to him, not just to argue or praise, but to share how the revelations resonated with their own lives. A woman wrote to say her family had been torn apart during the same period in Argentina, and Samuel's findings gave her closure she hadn't known she needed. A man recounted how his faith had wavered over the years, but hearing the truth spoken aloud reignited a sense of hope. These messages reminded Samuel why he'd done this in the first place, not for fame or recognition, but because stories like these deserved to be told. Despite the support, Samuel faced immense pressure. Death. Threats arrived almost daily, forcing him to hire security guards and install cameras around his home. Friends and colleagues warned him to step back, fearing for his safety. But Samuel refused to back down. He believed in the importance of transparency, especially when it came to institutions that shaped so many lives. To him, staying silent would have been the greater betrayal. Meanwhile, the debate raged on. Talk shows invited theologians, historians, and ethicists to weigh in. Online forums buzzed with discussions about morality, forgiveness, and the nature of leadership. Some argued that holding leaders accountable was essential for progress, while others worried that focusing on past mistakes risked overshadowing the good Pope Francis had done. It was a messy, complicated conversation, and one that showed no signs of slowing down. Through it all, Samuel couldn't help but reflect on the human side of the story. This wasn't just about politics or religion. It was about flawed individuals trying to navigate impossible situations. It was about the weight of decisions made under pressure and the lasting impact those choices had on real people. And ultimately, it was about whether humanity could find a way to confront its past without losing sight of its capacity for growth and redemption. What happened next would test everyone involved and bring emotions to the surface in ways no one expected. As the days turned into weeks, the world seemed to split into two camps. On one side were those who saw Samuel's revelations as a betrayal, a deliberate attempt to tarnish the reputation of a man beloved by millions. They argued that focusing on past decisions, no matter how significant, was unfair and even cruel. After all, Pope Francis had dedicated his life to serving others, advocating for the poor, and pushing for reforms within the Church. Shouldn't his actions today outweigh whatever happened decades ago? On the other side were those who believed the truth couldn't be ignored. For them, it wasn't about attacking Pope Francis personally, but about holding powerful institutions accountable. If the Church wanted to earn trust, they argued, it had to confront its history honestly, not sweep uncomfortable truths under the rug. These voices grew louder as more people began sharing their own stories, connecting Samuel's findings to broader issues of justice and transparency. The tension reached a boiling point when protests erupted in cities around the world. In some places, crowds gathered outside cathedrals, holding signs that read, "Truth matters," or "Faith without accountability is empty." Others organized prayer vigils, standing in solidarity with Pope Francis and urging compassion over judgment. The divide was palpable, even among families and friends. Conversations at dinner tables became heated debates, and social media feeds turned into battlegrounds of opinion. Amidst the chaos, Samuel found himself caught in the middle. Some hailed him as a hero, a brave soul willing to challenge authority for the sake of truth. Others vilified him, accusing him of exploiting religion for personal gain. Strangers approached him in public, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with anger. One day, a woman stopped him on the street, tears streaming down her face. "You've given me answers I've waited years for," she said, clutching his arm. Moments later, a man shouted insults at him, calling him a traitor to the faith. Despite the hostility, Samuel refused to retreat. He continued giving interviews, explaining his research and emphasizing the importance of open dialogue. "This isn't about blame," he often said. "It's about understanding. We can't move forward unless we're honest about where we've been." His calm demeanor and unwavering commitment began to win over skeptics, though many still doubted his motives. Meanwhile, inside the Vatican, the atmosphere was tense. Cardinals and bishops held closed-door meetings, debating how to respond to the growing controversy. Some pushed for a full investigation, believing transparency would restore trust. Others urged caution, worried that digging deeper might uncover even more uncomfortable truths. Pope Francis himself remained largely silent, choosing instead to focus on his daily duties, meeting with pilgrims, delivering sermons, and visiting communities in need. But silence only fueled speculation. Rumors swirled about secret meetings, hidden documents, and potential resignations. Journalists camped outside St. Peter's Square, desperate for any scrap of information. The pressure mounted until finally, Pope Francis decided to address the issue directly. One Sunday morning, during his weekly blessing in St. Peter's Square, the Pope took a moment to speak from the heart. Standing before thousands of worshippers, he looked out over the sea of faces and sighed deeply. For a long time he said nothing, letting the weight of the moment settle over the crowd. Then in a voice tinged with emotion he began to speak. "I have heard your questions, your doubts, your pain," he said, his words echoing through the square. "And I understand why you feel the way you do. I am not perfect. I never claimed to be. Like all of us, I have made mistakes, choices that haunt me to this day. There are moments in my past that I wish I could change, moments where I wonder if I did enough or too little." His voice cracked as he continued. "But I stand here today not to defend myself, but to ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness from those who have suffered because of decisions made long ago. Forgiveness from those who feel let down by the institution I represent. And forgiveness from God, who knows my heart better than anyone." The crowd fell silent, many wiping away tears. Some knelt in prayer while others simply stared, stunned by the raw vulnerability of the man before them. It was a rare moment, one that transcended politics and religion, and reminded everyone present of the shared humanity that binds us all. When the speech ended, the square erupted in applause, though it was clear the journey was far from over. Questions still lingered, wounds still needed healing, and trust still had to be rebuilt. But for the first time in weeks there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this storm could lead to something meaningful. For Samuel, watching the scene unfold on television, it was both humbling and heartbreaking. He had set out to uncover the truth, not to cause division or pain. Yet here he was, witnessing firsthand the power of honesty to spark reflection, conversation, and even reconciliation. As he sat alone in his apartment that night, surrounded by stacks of papers and books, he allowed himself a small smile. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain: the world would never look at faith or leadership the same way again. In the days following Pope Francis's heartfelt address, the world seemed to pause. The speech had struck a chord, a deep emotional note that resonated across continents and cultures. For some, it was an act of profound humility. For others, it raised more questions than answers. But one thing was undeniable: the Pope's words had shifted the conversation. What began as outrage and division now felt like the start of something bigger, a collective reckoning with the complexities of human nature. Samuel watched the aftermath unfold from his small apartment in Rome. He spent hours glued to the news, reading articles, listening to interviews, and scrolling through social media threads. People were talking, not just about Pope Francis or the revelations he had uncovered, but about faith, forgiveness, and what it means to be human. Strangers shared their own struggles with guilt and redemption. Families debated how to balance justice with mercy. Even skeptics found themselves drawn into discussions they might have avoided before. For Samuel, this shift was both rewarding and overwhelming. On one hand, he felt vindicated. His decision to go public hadn't been easy, but seeing people engage so deeply with the issues made him believe it was worth it. On the other hand, the backlash continued. Hate mail piled up in his inbox, and anonymous threats forced him to take precautions he never imagined he'd need. Some nights he lay awake wondering if he'd done the right thing. Was it fair to drag the past into the present? Could anyone truly bear the weight of such scrutiny? Despite the challenges, Samuel tried to focus on the positives. More and more people were reaching out to thank him, not just for exposing the truth, but for sparking conversations they said were long overdue. A priest from South America wrote to say that Samuel's work had inspired him to reflect on his own role within the church. "Your courage has reminded me why transparency matters," the message read. "We can't serve others if we're afraid to face ourselves." Others shared stories of personal transformation. One woman recounted how her family had been torn apart during the same turbulent period in Argentina that Samuel's research highlighted. For years she carried anger and resentment, unable to make sense of what had happened. But hearing Pope Francis speak openly about regret gave her permission to forgive, not just him, but also herself. "I didn't realize how much I needed closure until now," she wrote. "Thank you for helping me find peace." These messages kept Samuel going, even when the pressure felt unbearable. They reminded him that behind every headline, tweet, or comment was a real person grappling with real emotions. This wasn't just about history or religion, it was about humanity. And humanity, flawed as it is, has an incredible capacity for growth. As the weeks passed, the Vatican took tentative steps toward addressing the controversy head-on. Pope Francis announced the formation of a special commission tasked with investigating the claims Samuel had brought to light. Comprised of historians, theologians, and independent experts, the group was given full access to the Church's archives, a move many saw as unprecedented. Critics argued it was too little, too late, while supporters praised it as a bold step toward accountability. The announcement sparked mixed reactions. Some hailed it as proof that the Church was willing to confront its past, while others dismissed it as a PR stunt designed to deflect criticism. Either way, it kept the story alive, ensuring that the conversation wouldn't fade anytime soon. Journalists followed every development closely, speculating about what the commission might uncover. Would it confirm Samuel's findings? Or would it reveal new layers to the story no one had anticipated? Amidst the uncertainty, Samuel received an unexpected invitation. A prominent Catholic university asked him to deliver a lecture on ethics, history, and the importance of truth-telling. At first he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, and he worried about stirring up more controversy. But after some thought, he accepted. If there was ever a time to share his perspective, this was it. The event drew a large crowd. Students, professors, clergy members, and curious onlookers filled the auditorium. As Samuel stepped onto the stage, he felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. But once he started speaking, his nerves melted away. He spoke passionately about the power of history to teach lessons, the value of transparency in leadership, and the need for empathy in times of crisis. "We often think of truth as something cold and objective," he said, pausing to look at the audience. "But it's not. Truth is messy. It's complicated. It forces us to confront things we'd rather ignore, and yet, it's also liberating. When we face the truth, no matter how painful, we create space for healing, understanding, and change." His words earned a standing ovation, and afterward, dozens of attendees lined up to shake his hand or share their thoughts. Many expressed gratitude, saying his talk had given them hope. Others admitted they still struggled with the revelations but appreciated the chance to think critically about them. For Samuel, it was a reminder that progress isn't always immediate. It's incremental, built on moments of connection and reflection. Back home, as Samuel reviewed notes from the lecture, he realized something important. This journey wasn't just about uncovering secrets or challenging authority. It was about fostering dialogue, about creating opportunities for people to come together, ask hard questions, and seek answers collectively. Whether the commission uncovered more truths or simply reinforced what was already known, the real victory lay in the conversations happening along the way, and yet Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead. Reckoning with the past is never easy, especially when it involves institutions as old and influential as the Catholic Church. But as he looked out his window at the bustling streets of Rome, he allowed himself a moment of quiet optimism. Maybe, just maybe, this storm would lead to something meaningful, not just for the church but for everyone touched by its reach. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of Samuel's revelations began to settle into something more profound. A slow, steady shift in how people thought about faith, leadership, and humanity itself. The Vatican Commission tasked with investigating the claims worked quietly behind closed doors, sifting through centuries-old documents and piecing together fragments of history. Updates were scarce, but the mere existence of the commission signaled a willingness to face uncomfortable truths, an acknowledgement that even sacred institutions are not above scrutiny. Outside the walls of the Vatican, life moved on, yet the impact lingered. Conversations sparked by Samuel's findings continued to unfold in unexpected ways. In coffee shops, classrooms, and living rooms around the world, people found themselves revisiting old beliefs and questioning new ones. Some Catholics chose to leave the church altogether, feeling disillusioned by what they saw as hypocrisy. Others doubled down on their faith, finding strength in its imperfections and viewing the controversy as an opportunity for growth. For many, it became less about abandoning or defending the church and more about understanding the complexities of human frailty. Samuel noticed this shift firsthand. His inbox was still flooded daily, but the tone of the messages had changed. Fewer insults, more thoughtful reflections. One email stood out among the rest. A man wrote about his struggles with doubt after learning about the revelations. "I've spent years trying to reconcile my faith with the flaws I see in its leaders," he confessed. "But your work reminded me that faith isn't about perfection. It's about connection. It's messy, just like us." The message resonated deeply with Samuel. He had always believed that truth wasn't meant to destroy, but to illuminate, to shine a light on the cracks so healing could begin. Yet he couldn't deny the toll it took on him personally. The constant spotlight wore him down, and the threats, though fewer now, still arrived regularly enough to keep him cautious. Friends urged him to take a break, to step away from the chaos and focus on himself. But Samuel couldn't. Not yet. There was too much at stake. One evening, while walking through the narrow streets of Rome, Samuel stumbled upon a small church tucked between two buildings. Its wooden doors were slightly ajar, inviting passers-by to enter. Curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped inside. The interior was modest. No grand statues or ornate decorations, just simple pews and flickering candles casting soft shadows on the stone walls. It felt peaceful, almost timeless. As Samuel sat in silence, he reflected on everything that had happened since he first opened that dusty manuscript. He had set out to uncover the truth, not knowing where it would lead. Now, here he was sitting in a quiet church, wondering if he'd done enough or too much. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time in months he allowed himself to breathe. Maybe this moment of stillness was exactly what he needed. Back home, Samuel decided to write an open letter. He poured his thoughts onto the page, sharing his journey. The late nights translating ancient texts, the fear of backlash, the overwhelming sense of purpose that kept him going. But he also wrote about hope. Hope that honesty could pave the way for healing. Hope that people would remember forgiveness is not weakness but strength. And hope that the conversations sparked by his work would continue long after the headlines faded. When the letter went public, it struck a chord. Readers praised Samuel's vulnerability, calling it a reminder of why his efforts mattered. Even critics softened their stance, acknowledging the sincerity behind his words. For once, the noise subsided, replaced by a collective pause, a moment, to reflect on how far everyone had come. Meanwhile, the Vatican Commission finally released its preliminary report. The findings confirmed much of what Samuel had uncovered, though they added nuance and context missing from earlier interpretations. Archbishop Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, had indeed faced difficult choices during a dark chapter in Argentina's history. While some decisions saved lives, others left scars that never fully healed. The report didn't shy away from these truths, nor did it paint the Pope as either a saint or a sinner. Instead, it presented him as something far more relatable. Human. Pope Francis responded to the report with humility. In a televised address, he thanked the Commission for its work and acknowledged the pain caused by past actions. "We cannot change what has been done," he said, "but we can learn from it. We can listen, apologize, and strive to do better." His voice trembled as he spoke, a raw reminder of the burden carried by those who lead. The reaction was mixed, but largely positive. Many appreciated the transparency and vowed to support reforms aimed at preventing similar mistakes in the future. Others remained skeptical, arguing that apologies weren't enough without tangible change. But even skeptics admitted the process marked a turning point, a rare instance of accountability within such a powerful institution. For Samuel, the report brought a sense of closure, not because every question had been answered or every wound healed, but because it proved that facing the past wasn't the end. It was the beginning. People were talking, listening, and working toward solutions. That alone gave him hope. As winter approached, Samuel returned to his routine of research and writing. The frenzy had died down, leaving behind a quieter, more introspective atmosphere. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, for the Church, for himself, or for anyone touched by the revelations. But he also knew that progress rarely comes without struggle. And sometimes, the most meaningful changes start with uncomfortable truths. One afternoon, while organizing his notes, Samuel came across the original manuscript that started it all. Its pages were worn now, edges frayed from countless readings. He smiled faintly, running his fingers over the faded ink. What began as a curiosity had grown into something far greater than he ever imagined. As he placed the book back on the shelf, he whispered softly to himself, "It was worth it." Even amidst uncertainty, Samuel felt a flicker of optimism. Whatever challenges lay ahead, one thing was clear. Humanity's capacity for reflection, growth, and redemption was limitless. And perhaps in confronting the shadows of the past, people had taken a step closer to finding light. Months had passed since the Vatican Commission released its report, and while the headlines no longer dominated the news cycle, the impact of Samuel's revelations continued to ripple through society. Conversations about accountability, forgiveness, and growth weren't confined to religious circles anymore. They spilled into everyday life. People began reflecting on their own choices, relationships, and communities in ways they hadn't before. It was as if the world had been given permission to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about institutions, but about themselves. Samuel noticed this shift in subtle ways. Strangers would approach him at cafes or bookstores, thanking him for inspiring them to have difficult conversations with loved ones. A teacher told him she'd started discussing ethics and morality with her students, using his story as an example of how truth can lead to change. Even people who didn't agree with everything he had done acknowledged that his work made them think differently about trust and leadership. These moments reminded Samuel why he had taken such a huge risk. Because stories like these mattered, more than any headline ever could. But life wasn't without its challenges. The backlash hadn't disappeared entirely. Some critics still accused him of undermining faith for personal gain, while others dismissed his findings as incomplete or biased. Yet Samuel handled it all with patience. He knew he couldn't please everyone, nor did he expect to. What mattered most was staying true to his intentions, to uncover the past honestly and let people decide what to do with the information. One day, Samuel received an invitation that caught him off guard. The Vatican asked him to attend a private event hosted by Pope Francis himself, a gathering meant to honor those working toward transparency and reconciliation within the Church. At first, Samuel hesitated. He wondered if accepting the invitation might be seen as seeking approval or validation. But after some thought, he realized it wasn't about him. It was about acknowledging progress, however small. So, he accepted. The event took place in a quiet courtyard inside the Vatican grounds. Sunlight filtered through tall trees, casting golden patterns on the cobblestone floor. Guests mingled quietly, exchanging smiles and polite conversation. When Pope Francis entered, the room fell silent. He walked slowly, leaning on his cane, his face etched with lines of both age and wisdom. As he reached Samuel, he paused and extended his hand. "Thank you," the Pope said simply, his voice soft but steady. His eyes met Samuel's, filled with a mix of pain and gratitude. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Samuel nodded, unable to find words but knowing none were needed. It wasn't an apology or absolution. It was recognition of shared humanity, a mutual understanding that even the hardest truths can lead to healing. Afterward, Samuel found himself reflecting on the encounter. He had never imagined standing face to face with the very person whose past he had exposed. Yet here they were, two imperfect humans navigating a complicated world together. It struck him then. Maybe that was the point. Not to vilify or exalt anyone, but to remind everyone that we're all flawed, striving to do better despite our mistakes. As weeks turned into months, Samuel returned to his quiet life of research and writing. The chaos of the past year faded into the background, replaced by a deeper sense of purpose. He began working on a book, a collection of essays exploring the themes of truth, history, and human connection. Each chapter drew from his experiences, weaving personal reflections with historical insights. Writing became therapy for him, a way to process everything he'd been through, while also sharing lessons he hoped others might find valuable. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church embarked on reforms, inspired by the Commission's findings. New policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability were introduced, though implementation would take time. Critics argued the changes didn't go far enough, while supporters praised them as steps in the right direction. Either way, the dialogue remained alive, a testament to the power of honesty to spark meaningful action. For many Catholics, the journey was deeply personal. Some found renewed faith in a church willing to confront its flaws. Others chose different paths, seeking spirituality outside traditional structures. But regardless of where they landed, one thing united them: a desire for authenticity. They wanted leaders and institutions that reflected their values, warts and all. As winter gave way to spring, Samuel spent more time outdoors, enjoying Rome's vibrant streets and historic charm. One sunny afternoon, he visited St. Peter's Square, watching pilgrims gather beneath Michelangelo's towering dome. Children chased pigeons, couples snapped photos, and priests greeted visitors with warm smiles. Life went on, as it always does, carrying forward the weight of history alongside hopes for the future. Standing there, Samuel felt a profound sense of peace. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, for the Church, for himself, or for anyone touched by the revelations. Mistakes would be made, wounds reopened, and new challenges faced. But he also believed in humanity's resilience. People have an incredible capacity to grow, adapt, and forgive when given the chance. That evening, as he sat in his apartment, surrounded by books and papers, Samuel picked up a pen and wrote a single sentence in his journal. "Truth may hurt, but silence kills." It summed up everything he'd learned over the past year. The importance of speaking up even when it's hard, and trusting that light will eventually break through the darkness. Years later, when historians looked back on this chapter, they wouldn't focus solely on scandals or controversies. Instead, they'd see it as a turning point, a moment when humanity chose to face its imperfections head-on. And perhaps, just perhaps, they'd remember Samuel not as someone who sought fame or fortune, but as a man who dared to shine a light on the shadows, believing that truth could set us free.